Today we will start our story in the USA before going to England. So sit back as we go to the late 19th century. Florence Elizabeth Chandler was born on the 3rd of September 1862 in the port city of Mobile in Alabama. Her father was named William George Chandler and was a partner in a bank. He was well respected in the city and had also served as its mayor. When she was very young, her father died and her mother, named Caroline, married a German baron who had been an officer in the German army. Florence received a good education and was known to be a charming, attractive young lady. She was adventurous and high-spirited and very popular amongst her peers. On the 12th of March, 1880, along with her aunt, she boarded the steamship the SS Baltic, which was travelling from New York to Paris via Liverpool. They had planned to visit the great cities of Europe and the continent's most fashionable coastal resorts. The voyage to Liverpool took 6 days, in which time the attractive young lady was noticed by most of the other passengers, one of whom was the well-known cotton merchant, James Maybrick. James was born and raised in Liverpool. He was a son of an engraver and had grown from his humble upbringing to be the owner of his own cotton trading business. He was born on October the 24th, 1838, so was 24 years older than Florence, but he wasted no time in informing the young, impressionable lady he had opened an office in Norfolk, Virginia, and now spends his time between the USA and England, building up his business. Florence seemed fascinated by his story, and in what could be considered an impetuous decision, she decided to disembark the ship at Liverpool and not continue with her planned trip to Paris. James, however, did not tell the young lady everything about himself and kept a dark secret from her. He did reveal that he had caught malaria in Virginia in the 1870s and made a full recovery, but he did not add that following his treatment, he was now addicted to medicines which contained substances such as strychnine, phosphoric acid, and arsenic. He also didn't tell her that he had a mistress named Sarah Ann Robertson, who he supported financially and who he would frequently visit when he had business meetings in the Whitechapel area of London. With her, he had 5 illegitimate children. On the 7th of July, 1881, Florence and James married at the St James Church in the Piccadilly area of London. Soon after, they returned to Virginia, where James spent his time building up his cotton business. The marriage seemed to be happy, and Florence gave birth to 2 children. Then in 1884, the couple returned to Liverpool and set up home at the very impressive Battlecrease House, very close to the River Mersey. Life in England was very different for Florence. She had been raised by a wealthy mother and had been used to a very social and affluent lifestyle. Now she was living in one of Europe's fastest growing cities. It was industrial and fast-paced, and she didn't know many people. Her social calendar was rarely full, and her husband also spent many days away on business trips. Florence started to feel isolated. In 1887, James told his wife that the business was not doing very well, and she would have to make changes to her spending habits. This was something somewhat alien to her, as she had been used to spending money whenever she needed, so decided to just borrow it by using her fine jewellery as collateral. But she started to get into debt. She was careful to hide these debts from her husband, but as the debts mounted, she started to worry. She confided in her mother by writing to her. She wrote that every time there was a knock at the door, she feared that it was someone arriving to collect a debt. However, financial difficulties were not the only thing to concern her in 1887. As her son contracted scarlet fever and worried for their daughter's health, they sent her away so as not to catch the disease. Florence's son survived, but a few months later, her brother named Holbrook died in Paris, and the cause of his death was given as consumption. Florence continued to feel alone. Her husband was spending more and more time in London, and it later became known to her that James had a mistress in Whitechapel to whom he paid the sum of £100 a year, and who he had been visiting and financially supporting for over 20 years. Florence confronted her husband about his infidelity, but perhaps because of his financial problems, or perhaps because he had little regard for his wife, he made light of the issue and told her she had other things to concern herself with. In the spring of 1888, Florence, now fed up with feeling totally betrayed, was courted by a young cotton broker named Alfred Brearley. He was a family friend and conducted business with her husband James. Over the previous 2 years, affection had been a stranger to Florence. She was now 27 years old and living away from her homeland, so the advances made by Alfred were reciprocated, and the two of them would meet whenever they could. But Florence did not remain discreet, and in mid-March 1889 booked a hotel room in London for her and Alfred, and for some strange reason made the reservation in the name of Mr. and Mrs. Thomas Maybrick, which were the names of her brother and sister-in-law. Gossip and rumour were very much part of life in Victorian Britain, so it was no surprise that on the 29th of March 1889 things came to a head when James discovered his wife's infidelity. They had gone to the famous horse race, the Grand National at Aintree Racecourse, and the couple began to argue. When they returned home, they had another very big argument, which was only stopped when the servants and the local doctor intervened. After the couple had calmed down, they agreed that James would pay off his wife's debts, and Florence would break off her relationship with Alfred. It was, however, clear to everyone that the couple no longer got on. They continued to live together. Divorce was not common at the time, with only 5 couples in every 1,000 getting one. Florence was also aware that divorce would mean she would be left with nothing and would have no option but to leave her children and go back to America with her mother. She would have to make the marriage work, but James was still addicted to his medications and continued to work long hours and travelled frequently to London. In mid-April 1889, Florence purchased some flypapers. These were common at the time, and flies would land on them and die. Florence, however, did not use them to trap flies, and instead she soaked them in a bowl. She told her housekeeper, named Alice Yap, that she was soaking them to extract the arsenic, as it would help her improve her complexion. It was difficult to obtain arsenic at the time, and soaking flypaper was a common practice. James continued to self-medicate, and over the years his reliance on medication had only increased. Then, on the 27th of April, he became quite ill. A doctor was called and diagnosed severe dyspepsia. He prescribed a cyanide-based medicine, but as his condition worsened, Florence employed a nurse to care for him. On the 7th of May, Florence received a letter from Alfred Brearley telling her that he was going to live overseas. This greatly distressed her, so she immediately wrote back to him. She gave the letter to the housekeeper to post, but the housekeeper decided not to post it. Instead, she passed it on to James's brother. James's condition didn't improve, and he spent most of his time in bed. Everyone was very concerned about him, and no one could understand why he was taking so long to get better. On the 9th of May, Florence removed a bottle of tonic named Valentine's meat juice. This was a common pick-me-up in the 19th century. She left the room and returned a few minutes later and placed the innocent-looking bottle by her husband's bedside. The nurse, however, had grown suspicious of Florence, so removed it and gave it to James's brother. He sent it to be examined, and it was found to contain half a grain of arsenic. The following day, May the 10th, Florence poured her husband's medicine into a large bottle. When she was questioned on why she was doing this, she said that it was easier to stir. Again, the medicine was removed and analysed, but the results showed that nothing had been added. The family and the nurse had grown very suspicious of Florence. They searched the house and found large amounts of arsenic. The amount Florence would have generated from the flypaper was very small in comparison. The next day, May the 11th, James Maybrick died. A post-mortem was held and arsenic was found in the deceased's body, but it was concluded that there was not enough to actually cause death. It was, however, confirmed that he had died due to a prolonged period of poisoning. On the 18th of May, Florence was arrested and taken to the Walton jail. Again, she was completely alone. She was never really liked by her husband's friends, and now that her relationship with Alfred Brearley had been made public, they seemed keen to witness her downfall. She was questioned extensively by the police, and they decided to charge her with the murder of her husband, James Maybrick. The trial of Florence Maybrick took place at Liverpool St George's Hall. Florence's mother employed a very well-known and successful barrister to defend her, named Sir Charles Russell. The medical evidence was confusing and somewhat contradictory. The defence tried to outline that there was a very low amount of arsenic found in James's body, so it could not confidently be presumed that this had caused his death. But there was the flypaper and the bottle of meat juice that had been contaminated with arsenic. This evidence, coupled with her problematic marriage and her well-known relationship with Alfred Brearley, meant that the prosecution reminded the court of how Florence could have benefited from the death of her husband. The jury was also never totally informed about the extent of James's addiction to arsenic and strychnine. Florence decided to enter the dock in her own defence. She tried to defend the soaking of the flypaper by saying that she had lost her prescription for her arsenic-based face cream, and she told the court that the reason that arsenic was discovered in the meat juice was because her husband had implored her to add it, as he firmly believed that it helped him feel better. However, any sympathy that she may have received from the all-male jury was soon forgotten when she admitted to her relationship with Alfred. The judge was an elderly gentleman named James Fitzjames Stephen. When he summed up the case, he said to the jury, "You must consider that it is a horrible and dreadful thought that a woman should be plotting the death of her husband in order that she might be left at liberty to follow her own degrading vices." When the jury were eventually sent out to consider the case, it only took them 35 minutes to find Florence Maybrick guilty of murder, and the judge sentenced her to death. The case had been reported in both Britain and America, and for the next few days, the verdict was a topic of conversation on both sides of the Atlantic. Some believed Florence to be guilty, others argued that she was innocent and had only been found guilty by a jury of 12 men, as she had admitted to her infidelity. Her defence team petitioned the Home Secretary to commute the sentence, and eventually, just 4 days before her scheduled execution date, Florence Maybrick's sentence was changed to life in prison. It was later reduced further to 15 years. Florence was released from prison in 1904, and after spending a short time in a convent in the coastal town of Truro, she returned to America. She wrote a book about her life called My Lost 15 Years and travelled around America giving lectures. She never saw either of her children again. Florence died, poor and alone, in 1941, aged 79. But the story doesn't end there. In 1992, a 19th century diary emerged, allegedly written by Jack the Ripper, and although the diary's author does not actually identify himself by name, it is quite obvious from various personal references that it was written by James Maybrick. In the diary, the writer states that after he had seen his wife with another man in the Whitechapel area of Liverpool, he was so enraged that he went to the Whitechapel district of London, an area which he knew well, and committed the Whitechapel murders. Some people think that the diary is genuine and that James Maybrick is in fact Jack the Ripper. Others are more sceptical, saying that he was never ever considered a suspect until the diary emerged, and that there is no scientific evidence to prove that the diary is genuine. They also say that it is not clear if James had known about his wife's adultery until 1889, and point out that nothing is written in the diary that could have not been found by reading about the Whitechapel murders in the newspapers. A year after the diary emerged, a gold watch was found. with the initials of Jack the Ripper's 5 victims scratched inside, together with the signature of James Maybrick and the words, "I am Jack." The watch has been subjected to scientific analysis, and the scratches have been found to be compatible with the period 1888 to 1889, but these results are disputed. Many people also consider that the watch appearing so soon after the diary is somewhat suspicious, and remind us that even if the watch and the diary can be dated back to 1888, it does not mean that they are written by or owned by Jack the Ripper, as there were many frauds and hoaxes associated with the late 19th century. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As per usual, please leave any comments or feedback you might have, and please let me know if you think that James Maybrick may have been Jack the Ripper, and I will see you in the next brief case.